So, in today's mega project, we're going to cover the design, production, and performance of one of the most iconic tanks of all of World War II. A Soviet tank that was considered a mechanical marvel, a formidable beast of steel that struck fear into the hearts of Axis tankers, chasing them all the way back to Berlin. But we're also going to discuss another tank, one that was dismissed as a total lemon, a blob of hideous scrap metal, a death trap for expendable Soviet tank crews, a vehicle that could not oppose the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. The first tank that we're going to talk about is, of course, the T-34 medium tank, and the second tank we're referring to is it's also the T-34 medium tank. Much like Marmite or Nickelback, military history buffs either love it or hate it, but they certainly can't ignore it. So let's explore together the history of this tank and find out if the T-34 was in fact a hunk of junk, a savior of the motherland, or somehow, maybe it was both. Now, the story of the T-34 begins in 1937. Back then, a large part of Soviet tanks consisted of BT fast tanks. These vehicles had shown their limitations during the Soviet intervention in the Spanish Civil War, where they had shown their vulnerabilities in an urban warfare setting, especially against opponents using guerrilla tactics. Paradoxically, BTs performed well enough against other armoured units, but were easy prey to light infantry weapons such as petrol bombs, especially if hurled from the top of a building. The High Command of the Armoured and Motorised Forces of the Red Army, or ABTV, on August 15, 1937, issued Resolution No. 94, calling for the design of a new fast tank. The design specifications were the new vehicle to have a 400 horsepower diesel engine, 20 to 25 millimeters of armor, and a 45 to 75 millimeter gun which could be raised to a steep angle so as to take out those pesky Spaniards that were throwing bombs from the top of buildings. A design team, KB-34, was assembled at factory number 183 in Kharkov by chief designer M.I. Koshkin. In October 1937, Koshkin received an updated set of requirements which required for the armor to be sloped. In March 1938, Koshkin and his team delivered the first design called the BT-20 that incorporated another spec desired by the top military brass, a wheel and track suspension system. This system allowed for the tracks to be removed from the tank when traveling on roads, which helped to preserve the integrity of the tracks for when they were most needed, but this also made the suspension far more complex and very expensive to assemble. Koshkin objected to using this type of system, and in May of 1938, the Defense Committee gave KB-24 permission to design two tank prototypes, one with the wheel and track system and one without it. In February of 1939, Koshkin handed in his next piece of work. This was a design for what was now called the A-20, in both versions, with and without the dual suspension system. On the 27th of the month, the Defense Committee approved the construction of both prototypes. On May 4th, 1939, the Defense Committee met at the Kremlin and gave KB-24 permission to design two prototypes of the A-20, one with the track and wheel suspension and one without. The designs were ready by February 1939, and on the 27th of February, the Defense Committee approved the construction of both of these prototypes. So the early specimens were ready in June 1939 and they began test runs in July. Both models performed well, reaching top speeds of up to 85 kilometers an hour. The prototype featuring the track-only traction, now called the A-32, was slower than the other, but its simpler suspension system allowed it to increase the thickness and weight of its armor. The Defense Committee was encouraged by this detail, and in December they commissioned production of 10 track-only prototypes with a 45mm frontal armor. At this stage, the new model was already referred to as the T-34. By February 1940, the first ever two T-34s had rolled off the factory floor at Kharkov, and they were ready for a program of tests. In early factory trials, the T-34s proved to be faster and more agile than the BTs, but they also demonstrated some pretty glaring disadvantages. For example, the sloped armor was a guarantee of extra protection, more on that later, but it also hampered the visibility of the crew. Moreover, the interior was super cramped, and the V2 diesel engine failed after just 25 hours of operation. Nonetheless, Koshkin and his designers boarded the T-34 for the next test. On March the 6th, they set off from Kharkov to Moscow, covering the distance in 10 days. Once they arrived, the T-34s were inspected by Stalin himself. Certainly, that's going to be a nerve-wracking ordeal for Koshkin. But the dictator was pleased, so the tanks moved to the next stage of tests. At an army training ground, the T-34s were shot at with 37mm and 45mm anti-tank guns, taking very little damage. Then on June 7th, 1940, the Soviet Council of People's Commissars ordered Factory 183 to commence mass production of the T-34. Alright, so that T-34 you ordered has finally arrived at the dealership. It's got that lovely brand new tank smell, and you can't wait to go for a spin and perhaps do some donuts in the car park. Or maybe if you're more like me, you just want to make sure that the child seat fits in the back. So, before I hand you the keys, let me slap its roof like a good tank salesman and tell you more about this bad boy. Early T-34 models were 2.4 meters high, 7.5 meters long, and 2.9 meters wide. The interior was rather cramped, though fitting only 4 crew members who hopefully weren't basketball players. With a full crew and at full combat readiness, a T-34 weighed some 25 metric tons, which is 27.5 non-metric tons. You're welcome. So, a sizable beast, and yet also a nimble one, as it could easily clear obstacles as high as 0.8 meters, that's 2.6 feet. Such feats were propelled by the V2 diesel engine with a standard output of 400 to 450 horsepower, meaning that at full weight the tank could reach a top speed of 48 kilometers an hour or 30 miles per hour. When topped with 460 liters of diesel, the T-34 had a maximum range of 300 kilometers or 188 miles, provided that it traveled on paved roads. If trudging through uneven terrain, the tank could travel as far as 183 kilometers or 114 miles. These engines had first been designed and developed in 1933 at another factory in Kharkov, the diesel engines plant. It took years for the plant to improve their creation. Only in 1939 did engine tests prove that it could run continuously for 250 hours. The following year, it was deemed worthy of the T-34, entering mass production at factory number 75 in June 1940. Mass-produced specimens were of lesser quality than the test prototypes, but Factory 75 guaranteed they could run for 150 hours. In reality, for most of World War II, V2 engines had an average lifespan of 100 hours, one of the many issues with the T-34. Another aspect which designers did not nail from the start was its armament. The original gun mounted on T-34s was the L11 model with a caliber of 76.2 millimeters or 3 inches. The L11 had a muzzle velocity of 555 meters per second, which sounds incredibly fast, but apparently it wasn't enough for the shell to pierce standard armor plating. Fortunately, a better gun was already in development, the F-34 model. This weapon also boasted a 76.2mm caliber as well as a barrel length of 3.16 meters or 10 feet. More importantly, an armor-piercing shell could fly off the muzzle at a speed of 680 meters per second, which, for reference, just to make it a little bit more digestible, is 1,500 miles an hour. Thanks to the speed generated by the F-34 gun, its shells could penetrate 60 millimeters of steel armor. That's more than 2 inches, by the way, and it could do that at a distance of 1,000 meters or 0.6 miles. The F-34 gun was mounted on the turret, of course, another feature which was an apparent weakness from the very start. Designer Koshkin devised a small turret with steeply sloped sides. This made it a hard target for enemy gunners, certainly, but it also limited the mobility and visibility of the poor sods who had to operate inside the bloody thing. A T-34 commander would normally sit inside the turret, identifying potential threats and targets from within. While German tank commanders could peer out from a whole set of periscopes, their Soviet counterparts only had access to one single periscope and one view slit, severely limiting their field of vision. The turret had a positive aspect, though. It was fitted with an MB-20 electric motor, which allowed it to perform a complete 360-degree turn in just 10 seconds. Perhaps the most celebrated characteristic of the T-34 was its armor, thick and sloped. As mentioned earlier, the front plate consisted of 45mm, almost 1.8 inches of steel, and not just any steel. This was a special alloy called MZ2, developed by the researchers at the Mariupol factory. This alloy was sturdy, yet ductile, so that it could be compressed without it breaking. The protection offered by this thick plate of steel was compounded by its sloping armor, angled at 60 degrees. This presented 2 advantages. Shells which hit the T-34 at an angle would be deflected by the inclined surfaces and glanced off, dealing little to no damage. As per shells flying towards the medium tank while parallel to the ground, they were in for a surprise, as the angle in the sloped plate would effectively double its thickness. In other words, a 45mm plate inclined at 60 degrees can offer the same protection as 90mm of a non-inclined plate. Alright, okay, so on June the 22nd, 1941, Germany and its allies invaded the Soviet Union, and it was time for the T-34 to get to it. From the very start, German panzer crews realized that the medium tank was a bit of a tough cookie. At the outset of the invasion, the most modern German tanks were the Panzer IIIs and IVs. They both boasted a thicker front armor than the T-34, but it was not sloped. The Axis tanks deployed guns which were shorter than their Soviet counterpart, hence firing shells at a lower muzzle velocity. As a consequence, very rarely did hits from the Panzers manage to penetrate the T-34's armor. German artillery fared slightly better, especially when using 88mm guns, but these were still rare in the summer of 1941. The T-34 seemed to outclass its foes, and yet the early stages of Barbarossa were marked by decisive Axis victories. To put it simply, the T-34 was not a wonder weapon, far from it, and its use in combat brought to the fore many of its flaws. The entire cabin was cramped and not fitted with shock absorbers, which made it extremely fatiguing for the crews to travel in for a prolonged time. As mentioned earlier, the driver and the commander, who doubled as a gunner, suffered from poor visibility, which left much of their initiatives to their enemies. Moreover, most early T-34s lacked a radio, meaning that platoon leaders had to communicate with flags. But what mostly let the crews down were the mechanical failures. Their transmission failed so frequently that crews took to carrying a spare. The gearbox got stuck more often than not, to which tankers responded by hitting it with a sledgehammer. Crews couldn't even rely on the tracks of their T-34 as they could come apart from simple wear and tear, leaving them stranded in the middle of a battlefield, so that wasn't brilliant. These mechanical faults, frustratingly, accounted for about 50% of total losses of T-34s in the early stages of Barbarossa. As per the other 50%, well, we know that the T-34s were superior in terms of firepower and armor compared to Panzer IIIs, but the Germans could still score some serious hits with their anti-tank guns. When the Germans' shells hit hard enough, the Soviet armor had a tendency to spall. This is when the internal side of the armor could spew out a shower of sharp metal splinters, severely wounding the crews. And if the tank caught fire, crews often found it difficult to open on time the single extremely heavy turret hatch. An alternative was to use the fire extinguishers on board, but good luck with those as they emitted toxic carbon tetrachloride in the cramped interior. In addition to the specific flaws of the T-34 themselves, the units equipped with such tanks suffered from some serious disadvantages. First of all, the T-34s were still driven by rookie crews in the summer of 1941, and their commanders were even more inexperienced. You see, in 1936, Marshal Tukhachevsky had successfully introduced the deep battle, or Globokii Boy doctrine, which aggregated for the use of large mass formations of tanks to smash enemy lines and penetrate in depth beyond them. After Stalin's Great Purge, however, Tukhachevsky had been executed and his theories had fallen out of favor. By 1941, the armored doctrine inspired by Globokii Boy had made a comeback, but senior officers had little to no practical experience of how to maneuver large tank formations, leaving them as easy prey to the Axis armored spearheads. As a result, the invaders quickly encircled the armored units of the Special Western Military District, defeating them by July 8, 1941. So, as the war progressed, German tanks were consistently outnumbered by the Soviets, but their technical capabilities improved steadily. In the summer of 1942, Axis armored units were equipped with long-gunned Panzer IIIs and IVs, giving them the capability to knock out the T-34s from a long range. Moreover, the first Tiger Is appeared the same year, followed by the Panthers in 1943. The T-34, on the other hand, remains largely unchanged, except for some limited improvements. For example, the turret design was improved by adding an extra escape hatch, and the front armor was increased from 1.8 to almost 3 inches, or 75mm. Engineers also added external fuel tanks, extending the range by 50%. It was only at the end of 1943, however, that the T-34 was equipped with a more powerful weapon. This was the new 85mm gun, which replaced the previous 76mm one, and was specifically designed to knock out the recently introduced Panther tanks. The gun had been adapted from the model 1939 anti-aircraft gun. It had a muzzle velocity of 792 meters a second, or 2,600 feet per second, releasing shells which could penetrate 94mm or 3.7 inches of sloped armor at a distance of almost a kilometer or 1,000 yards. Despite these advancements, Soviet armor continued to suffer heavy losses against the Axis. In 1942 alone, the Red Army lost some 15,000 tanks, of which the majority were T-34s. The Soviet industrial complex, however, could withstand this onslaught. The major armaments factories were dismantled and then reassembled piece by piece east of the Urals, far from the Wehrmacht's reach. In 1943, the indefatigable Soviet workers produced 15,500 T-34s, which was almost triple the German tank output. In July and August of 1943, the T-34s were the star of the show at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. The Soviet medium tanks faced the German Tigers and Panthers, undoubtedly superior, but they still came out on top. This was a matter of numbers, but it wasn't just numbers. By this stage, Red Army commanders had learned, or rather relearned, the lessons of Marshal Tukhachevsky and knew how to make the best use of large armored units consisting of fast medium tanks. This was the essence of the deep battle doctrine after all. Waves of frontal assaults followed by deep thrusts into enemy lines, and the masses of newly produced T-34s were perfect for this. Now, as we all know, the Red Steamroller successfully pushed back Axis forces, chasing them all the way back to Berlin. And this success contributed to cementing the status of the T-34 as a fearsome machine. Production lines continued to crank out some 30,000 tanks between the end of the war in 1949, when the legendary medium tank was replaced by a newer model, the T-54. Despite the design becoming obsolete in 1949, the tanks themselves continued to see service with the Red Army, its Warsaw Pact allies, as well as Egypt and Syria until 1973. So, let's now return to today's initial question. What definition can best sum up the legacy of the T-34? Was it a piece of junk? Or was it a formidable weapon? And the answer is really that it's neither. When it was first released, the T-34 was arguably the best medium tank in the world, at least as far as its gun and armor were concerned. It was made with cheap, standardized parts, meaning the Soviet factories could assemble thousands of specimens much more quickly than their enemies and allies. During the course of the war, a total of 54,550 T-34s were produced. But on the other hand, we know that a T-34 could be knocked out of commission even before entering combat as a result of mechanical failure or simple wear and tear. And when T-34s did get into battle, they were vulnerable to superior German armament, at least from 1942 onwards. In fact, out of those 54,000 some tanks that we mentioned a minute ago, a total of 44,900 were irrecoverable losses, which is 82%. Those numbers may convey two completely opposite messages. You might look at those figures and think, well, it looks like the Soviets sure lost a lot of tanks. But you might also think, sure, but it looks like they were able to quickly and consistently replenish their losses. Now, that's the point that we should be focusing on. The T-34 medium tank can be assessed on a tactical level by its overall combat power. In other words, it can be judged based on its capability to win individual engagements or battles. And from this perspective, the T-34 was plagued by several flaws, and it was technically inferior to many of its adversaries. As a result, it never achieved a better than 1 to 3 kill-loss ratio. But a tank should be judged also on a strategic level. In other words, its capability to win a war. From this point of view, the T-34 was definitely a winning tank. Soviet factories were able to manufacture great numbers cheaply, quickly, and easily, sending hundreds of new specimens into battle every single month, thus overpowering the Axis invaders by tanks whose quality was satisfactory at best, but whose quantity was absolutely overwhelming.